Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Abby Evans. I am the Senior Director for Government Relations at Mentor, one of the co-hosts of today's great conversation, along with the Learning Policy Institute. We're so grateful that you could join us today. Before we jump right into our excellent content, I wanted to do one quick slide of housekeeping. We're all used to these by now. So just an FYI, we are recording this presentation. Each and every one of you, anyone who is registered for this webinar will receive the recording and a host of resources within a week of today's presentation. We have muted all of you just for best sound, but we are interested in hearing from you. So if you have questions throughout the presentation, please go ahead and drop them into the questions box. We will try our best to answer those. Our time is really short today and we have really great content. So we may not be able to answer them today, but we are going to collect those questions and make sure to get answers for you that we can respond to after the event. Zoom does have live captioning available. If you want to, you just have to turn it on your screen. And we're just gonna, if it hasn't already happened, a link to biographies of today's excellent round of speakers is available. We will also share that out with the recording and the resources in a few days' time. Because we have such a short amount of time, we're gonna skip doing individual biographies and introductions and get right to the heart of our work. So I am going to stop sharing my screen and invite David Shapiro from Mentor to join us.
Thanks, Abby. Well, we're a minute ahead of schedule, so all I can do is mess that up. So I'm gonna try to keep us on schedule, and we are so appreciative of those of you that are on. We know how much content is coming at you and the increase in webinars and opportunities to learn. And as we often say in the mentoring movement, you sort of express your values by how you spend your time. So we appreciate you spending your time with us and thinking with us and learning with us and continuing to explore and hopefully doing lots more work together to figure out how we don't leave relationships to chance. I mean, that's really the main prospect of this webinar. It's the prospect of our partnership here with LPI, and we're so appreciative to Linda Darling-Hammond, to Stephen, who will close us out, to Adam, who will speak, and the LPI team for the guidance that they're giving to districts and to LEAs around this dynamic time from a funding and also student-centered needs standpoint. Teachers' needs. I heard someone say we're in a navigating a generational moment. That moment has lasted a long time and is only in different phases. So as we enter a new phase, our partnership here today and the sort of dream team of researchers and practitioners and policy experts that we bring to you today in this sort of crash course is meant to sort of just be the beginning of making sure you know of the resources and people and examples that are out there. There are plenty of more. I would say we all represent many more people than just ourselves in terms of if you want to dive deeper, get other examples. I know all of us and all of our entities are here simply to sort of answer the premise of if you want to put relationships in the center for students. We know there's tools. We know they're important. We know there's probably not enough time. We know part of it is a structural and design challenge as well, which is why Mentor has a relationship-centered schools design process, and our affiliates locally who are locally grounded and really understand the landscape are able to partner with us to take schools and districts through that. We also have the National Mentoring Resource Center, which offers free technical assistance to schools and districts. But we know this is not about not a lack of intention or a lack of understanding that relationships are important. It's really about sort of like, how do we orient ourselves around that? How are our accountabilities around that? How are we staffed for that? And we have a lot of different student populations and ends that we're trying to meet. I just, again, want to thank you to everyone who's on this call, educators, policymakers, funders, Thank you for the ingenuity and commitment and resourcefulness that you have brought to this time, to our resilient and incredible young people and students throughout the country and our committed teachers. And thank you for all that we will continue to do together. I would, just kind of also tell you that we have tried to bring you a lot of approaches today, because we know there's no lack of people giving educators advice about what they should do, and education leaders. And we know this is certainly a place where one size does not fit all, and you're all not dealing with the same resources or the same sizes or the same structures. So we tried to bring you a really diverse thought from throughout the research and practice field. And again, hope this is just the beginning of us getting even more centered on the personalized needs of students, their supports, and their ability to find purpose and belonging. I get to introduce our first moderator of two panels. The first panel is a researcher panel, but I would tell you researchers that think a lot about practitioners and spend a lot of time with practitioners, the best kinds. Our moderator is an amazing researcher and thought leader and expert and rabble-rouser in Julia Freeland Fisher, who's the director of education at Clay Christensen Institute. In some ways, I feel so much like Julia's experience was sort of building to this moment before we ever knew this moment would arrive. Our first conversations were about technology and education and social capital, and she was exploring all of the utilities that were springing up around that. Little did we know that might be the only way young people and their teachers and mentors could connect in the marketplace. And that has grown even more. And then she wrote an incredible book called Who You Know, and has really championed the idea of social capital of a central promise of education and a central outcome of education. If we're giving young people the tools, identity, purpose, and belonging they need to strive and thrive on multiple pathways. So I am gonna get out of the way and get it into her capable hands. And I would also tell you, because I know she won't advertise it herself, that also the work that she has done gives you an incredible social capital toolkit that we will send out to you how to get to, and just continuing to try to demystify, if you accept this premise, which most of us do, we believe most of us do, how do you actually make good on it? How do you actually make good on that covenant with young people? So Julia, I'll toss it over to you. That's your time and expertise.
Thank you so much, David. And thanks also to the Learning Policy Institute for co-hosting this great event, which I think is really the coming together of two worlds, the world of schools and the worlds of mentoring, which it's sort of ironic that those are two different camps, given that they both are so focused on the lives of young people, but there's so much to learn and sort of cross-pollinate between the two. The title of our panel is Leveraging Relationship-Centered School Designs to Accelerate Learning. And I'm going to invite the esteemed panelists, Adam Edgerton of Learning Policy Institute, Sam McQuillan of the University of South Carolina, and Bernadette Sanchez of the University of Illinois, Chicago, to all turn on their cameras. Hello, everyone. Great to see you here. We're going to get right into it, because what we're going to do is hear from each of these experts about their research and what it tells us about really the opportunity in the school year ahead to focus on relationships. And what I'd say is that what I've observed over the past year or so is that you're hard pressed to find anyone in education who would dispute the idea that relationships matter. But the opportunity that we're talking about today is to go beyond that as a slogan or a cliche, and to actually make it a strategic priority in more school districts. And to do that in a way that's actually evidence-based, based on literally decades of research, largely in the mentoring world, about what works. And that's research around how relationships and learning are connected, how relationships and authentic support are connected, and how relationships and students' identity formation and skill development are sort of connected. And so diving right in, we're going to start off with Adam from Learning Policy Institute. You've highlighted in your research around, and particularly a report that we're going to drop into the chat around restarting and reinventing schools, that there's a lot of literature on the efficacy of mentoring programs to help students thrive. And there's a chance right now to integrate that evidence into schools. Can you talk a little bit, Adam, about what you and your colleagues found and some of your recommendations as people navigate the year ahead?
Yes, thank you, Julia. It's a pleasure to be here. I started off my career as a high school English teacher and then was an upward bound director for a federal TRIO program in Massachusetts. And I saw the importance of mentoring firsthand as a teacher and seeing what happened, both inside and outside of the classroom. And today I'm going to spend just like 3 minutes talking about the structures that we can put in place to help mentoring happen. If you go to the next slide, please, Abby. Yeah, thank you. The next one too. So recently we hosted a webinar series, a 5-series webinar with the Superintendents Association, AASA. And we were collecting anecdotes and details about how districts were spending federal recovery funds. And one of the lessons that we learned from that series and from other research is that the pandemic has allowed us to restructure time in schools. So for some, that meant having all of a sudden a Wednesday, a day in the middle of the week, where there could be greater connectivity, one-on-one meetings, as you had different groups of students coming to school, either the beginning or the end of the week. And one of the superintendents in the series, Dr. Baron Davis, who's the first African-American superintendent of Richland School District 2 in South Carolina, said that too often we use time as the constant and we don't see it as a variable in education that can be modified, adjusted, added, or subtracted. And so rather than go back to the kind of schedules and tight scheduling, low transition periods that characterize pre-pandemic schooling, a lot of districts are using expanded learning time to really allow for these mentorship structures. If you go to the next slide, please. And just to remind folks on the call that social and emotional learning has a broad evidence base. They lead to safer schools, greater belonging, higher achievement, higher graduation rates, and improved college and career readiness skills. And so as we think about the fall and there's conversations around learning loss, we want to make sure that when we talk about relationships, as Julia said, it's not just a cliche, but it really is about putting in place the structures for that connectivity to happen. And if we do that, then we'll have achievement gains that persist over time, as opposed to kind of short-term gains that we see when we focus only on standardized tested subjects, such as math and English in isolation. Next slide, please, Betty. And this is often hardest to do at the high school level. As a former high school English teacher, I know what it's like when we're siloed in our disciplines and we're used to transitioning from one class to the next, and they may not be connected to each other. But some districts are really thinking about how to restructure the high school. Grandview High School, this is in Washington State, has implemented a small cohort learning model. And initially that was to reduce the chance of infection. But they've continued with that because they've seen it allows for that one-on-one relationship building and mentoring. If you go to the next slide, please. Tutoring, I'll drop a link to the blog that we've written on tutoring that shows how important it is to happen during the school day if it can, but as a former upper bound director, after school tutoring can also be effective if tutors are well trained, they're supervised, and they get feedback for continuous improvement. And then we'll go to the last slide and share the resources. Restarting and Reinventing School, which is already in the chat. Also a blog that I've written with Linda Darling Hammond on how we can accelerate learning, which is more effective than remediation. More information about tutoring. And then finally, LPI has produced a series of fact sheets on how they can use federal recovery funds in expanded learning time. So there's specific concrete details that practitioners can use that are grounded in the research base so that we can help all of our students recover as we return to the fall. And that's it. I'll turn it over back to Julia, or the next panelist.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam. I think that's a really helpful, again, high level, because we're pressed for time, but high level look at sort of the what and the how that schools should be considering. And I want to pivot a little bit to the who, who can be in these relationships, powering students both learning and sense of belonging. And so I want to turn to Sam and some of the research you've done. And in particular, hear you voice over maybe what are the problems that youth are facing today? And based on some of the opportunities that Adam is highlighting around tutoring, around cohort design, et cetera, what kinds of partnerships need to be in place so that school staff and educators in particular aren't going it alone? Because we know that that efforts to build relationships can collapse under the weight of teacher to student ratios or counselor to student ratios. And time is a scarce resource, and so are relationships. But I think some of your recent research really highlights a way forward. Can you talk through that?
Great, thanks. I think probably to this panel, it's no secret that youth are struggling today. Even before the pandemic, political unrest, and chaos of the past 4 or 5 years, while nearly every indicator of prosperity was increasing in the U.S. and most of the world, things like physical health, wealth, academic outcomes, life expectancy, child mortality, so on and so forth. These are increasing almost every year. But if you actually look at the data, there's one indicator that resisted this trend of progress, and it stuck out like a sore thumb to most. Youth were not doing well socially or emotionally. Mental illness, social isolation, and loneliness were actually increasing. For example, youth suicide increased by 50% in a decade. Most internalizing problems worsened for students, sometimes by a factor of 2. And even like the skeptics who blame these increases on changes in measurement or mental health literacy acknowledge that today youth are lonelier than ever before because we've asked the same questions for over 70 years. Gen Z is the most loneliest generation in history, in recorded history. Many of the indicators that I mentioned before, prosperity, have actually survived the pandemic, but youth mental health has accelerated its decline to pretty startling levels for most mental health advocates. One of the maintaining factors of this problem is that we cannot scale mental health services to meet the demand. And I don't personally think we'll ever be able to do that if we rely on traditional direct services provided by highly trained professional, people with master's degrees or PhDs. It's just not going to happen. In fact, the supply and demand gap is expected to increase in the coming years, leaving more children or underserved. Part of my research, and obviously one of my soapboxes, is that many of the services that children benefit from for these worsening indicators don't have to be provided by highly trained professionals. They can be provided by regular helpers like mentors. When regular people who are motivated to help and are trained, supervised, and supported adequately, they can provide services that are of equal or better effectiveness for a range of problems that youth experience. There's also a lot more mentors than there are professional helpers. If you look at the numbers, even by the most conservative estimates, there's a dramatic potential to help reduce the supply and demand gap. Even if only 5% of mentors who are active in programs supported these efforts, they would still outnumber the total number of licensed psychologists. I see youth mentors as one untapped helper who could dramatically improve youth mental health promotion efforts. But there are obviously several practical, ethical, scientific, and legal hurdles that the field has to overcome to realize this potential. But I also think there's reasons to be optimistic that schools in particular are the ideal location for rolling out these efforts. I suggest 3 primary reasons that policy, funding, and scientific endeavors should strengthen and expand this variant of mentoring within schools. Number one, first, schools are where the kids are. And they're also one of the primary places that young people receive mental health services. Kids are 20 times more likely to enroll in mental health services in schools than elsewhere. Second, and I think this is important for this panel, is that schools are chock full of helping people, helping professionals who have expertise that mentors could benefit from within their helping efforts as mentors. It would be impossible for nonprofits to even approach the depth, breadth, or variety of helping capital that schools hold among counselors and psychologists, social workers, speech pathologists, and so on. It's an ecosystem that's ripe for supervising and supporting mentors. Access to data about child functioning, guidance and supervision and helping efforts, and team-based supports within the context of multi-tiered systems of support could be a total game changer and value that mentors add value to schools. Third, mentors complement and add value to mental health services in ways that traditional professional helpers can't. Helpers from the community do not carry the stigma that mental health professionals carry. They're also much more diverse than the mental health workforce, which has been and continues to be largely white, female, and middle class. There's also evidence that some parents from racially or ethnically diverse communities prefer their children to be supported by a mentor rather than a traditional mental health professional. Finally, in closing, I think there's also the possibility that community mentors can stick with kids throughout their schooling, as is the case in some professional mentoring organizations like Friends to Children, or in South Carolina like Real Champions. So in summary, I see there's tremendous promise in mentors having a seat at the table in child mental health promotion. I think realizing this promise is going to require some significant investments in building systems, infrastructure, and strategic partnerships. None of these things will be free. I'm optimistic that the American Rescue Plan Act could begin to provide support and resources for some of these schools and youth serving organizations. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sam. And I think on that last point, just as a big takeaway for our listeners, there's so much conversation about how to spend these, in some ways, abundant dollars that are coming to schools this coming year in the form of federal and state aid. But what you're describing is using those that financial capital to unlock relationship capital that is right now dormant in a lot of communities and that could really further services for students that we know they desperately need. So I think it's a really provocative and important point as people decide how to spend that money and maybe invest in those infrastructure tools and partnerships. Okay, Bernadette, last but certainly not least, this all sounds good. What Adam and Sam, I'm buying what they're selling, right? What Adam and Sam have laid out here. It sounds good in theory, but I wonder, just based on your research, if there are practices or priorities that schools might neglect when it comes to kind of well-intentioned efforts to build relationships. And what has your research suggested, and even your observations over the past year, are some of the greatest opportunities that might get missed if we don't call them out on panels like this?
Great. Thank you. Thank you to Sam and Adam for your comments. They were excellent and, really great suggestions, for folks to take away to their districts and schools. And thank you to Mentor and LPI for organizing this panel and for inviting me here today. One thing I wanted to mention before I answer your question, Julia, is that I helped mentor folks like Dudney and other staff in putting together a guidebook on how to promote mentoring relationships so that they influence socio-emotional learning. So it's a guidebook, and it has a few programs as examples where they do these mentoring interventions within schools, and it's targeted towards middle schools, but I think folks here today might find it very relevant. And one of the things we did is we also reviewed some research, and we looked at what were the activities that mentors were engaging in, what were some of the strategies that they were using to promote socio-emotional learning. And they talked about things like modeling pro-social behavior, providing unconditional regard, training the mentors to teach students self-regulation strategies. Mentors engage in trust-building techniques. They offered encouragement, advice modeling. So I know they put the resource in the chat here, but I think that that's a really good place to take a look at socio-emotional learning in schools. But to answer Julia's question, one of the things that came out of putting together that guidebook, even though it was focused just on middle school students, there were two gaps that were pretty glaring and relevant, to socio-emotional learning, but that we don't have enough research on it. And I think it's important, for schools to consider. And one of those is developing a positive identity. And oftentimes we don't think about students' identity and what that means to them and how that's relevant for school. And when I'm talking about positive identity, I'm referring to racial, ethnic identity, gender identity, sexuality. And research shows that developing a healthy and positive identity in these areas is related to positive outcomes in students' lives, including their performance in school and their achievement. And these identities are foundational to how they view themselves, how they think others view them. And many youth who are marginalized by our society are receiving, unfortunately, negative messages about their group, such as negative messages towards Black people, towards immigrants, towards people who identify as LGBTQ. So if youth are getting these negative messages, what do we do as adults within school settings to support young people in developing a positive identity despite all these negative messages that are around them? And we're coming out of a very stressful year, in which racism and many other isms have been very blatant and in the forefront in politics, in our laws, in healthcare, in the epidemic, in COVID this past year, the pandemics. And research shows that adults can help young people in developing a healthy and positive identity. And we put together a a blog post. I think we'll share it here in the chat, and on how mentors and programs can support young people in developing a positive racial ethnic identity, but I think you can apply it to other aspects of identity. But within schools, adults can help youth make the connections between what they're learning in school and who they are as individuals. And then just one last point, another area that I think is important for us to think about, as we go back to school in the fall, is helping students make sense of all the social issues and current events that they're observing in the world. So obviously in schools, we want kids, students to develop critical thinking skills, but are we also talking about, all their observations and the experiences that they have out in the community around societal inequality? What do they think of the current events, that are taking place? Some of them are getting involved and going out to the streets and marching and protesting, having conversations with them around that. And how do we support them as they engage in those efforts? And I wanted to mention that my colleagues and I did a study. It was of college students, but I think it's relevant to this audience here. But we were looking at how mentors support college students in how they think about social issues and also in their engagement in the community. And we found that mentors provided role modeling by engaging in the community themselves with or without their mentee. They engage in dialogue and reflection with students about social issues and about their involvement in the community. Mentors shared information and resources based on students' interests, on community issues. And then also students reported having non-judgmental conversations with their mentors around these social issues, because they felt like there were some adults in their lives, like their parents, where they felt like they couldn't be free to talk about all of their opinions and views. Whereas with mentors, they felt like they could do that, and it was a safe place where they could explore different viewpoints that might be controversial or different, from their family. And one thing I just wanted to end it with by saying that in these relationships, they were reciprocal. So it wasn't just the mentors imparting knowledge, but the young people were imparting knowledge to the mentors and sharing information with one another. So I'll close at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernadette. And I think that's just a really important reminder. The learning loss, unfinished learning, however you're hearing your school district call it, that conversation can, I think, inadvertently prize content over connection, and even connection over identity, right? And really thinking about the relationship across all three. I think all three of our panelists have commented on. Because we don't have a ton of time and we have really esteemed researchers, I want to talk about measurement real quick, which is if school districts and schools started to embrace some of the strategies that you guys are describing, what kind of data would tell them that they're being successful? And obviously, academic data is front and center in a lot of school districts, but are there other types of measures or data that schools should be thinking about paying attention to? And I'll let anyone weigh in here.
I think, I've noticed a lot of districts during the pandemic have relied on multiple measures, particularly as the validity of academic tests has been called into question. So the Rally platform is one that we found is spreading in California and in South Carolina, which is providing, interim assessments, surveys of social and emotional learning and wellness. And so those are the kinds of things that when you talk to administrators and that you ask them, like, are people doing well in mentoring? Are they liking tutoring? That they can point to those kinds of diagnostics as data points.
Thanks, Adam. Anything else?
The only thing I would add to that is I think there's a lot of emphasis on measuring student outcomes. It's really hard for school districts to determine whether or not something's effective by looking at outcome indicators for a number of reasons. I think what's often lacking, especially in mentoring program, is I'm actually more interested in what mentors are doing with young people and whether or not the mentees want to do those things or if their parents find them as a priority. I think some of the biggest measurement advances in both schools and in the field of mentoring could be focused on the characteristics and preferences of youth and their families, and then how mentors are meeting those preferences and characteristics and needs.
So measures of alignment around those priorities as opposed to sort of traditional outcomes. Bernadette, were you going to weigh in?
Yeah, just really quickly. I think, simple kinds of questions that could be asked of students is, you know, is there anyone they trust, you know, at the school? So when I do research on natural mentoring, most of the students do not name anyone at school. They name people outside of school. And it's good that they have someone outside of school, but is there an adult there, you know, who they see, you know, every day, who they trust? So asking that, do students feel a sense of belonging, you know, at their school, and do they feel like they're supported? So just asking also about their experience, you know, within the school environment, I think is important.
So powerful. The last thing I point some folks to, if you're not familiar with it on the call, is the developmental relationships framework from the Search Institute. They're increasingly looking at that as an instrument in schools to sort of think about the myriad ways that students experience hopefully positive relationships with the adults inside the building. I'm going to end on a lightning round with you guys, even though this whole thing feels like a lightning round. Which is just to urge you to synthesize kind of one piece of advice. If you were talking to your local superintendent right now, what's one piece of guidance or nugget from the research you'd offer for the year ahead, based on what you've been finding? And I'll go in the same order we went in. So Adam, if you can kick us off. One piece of advice for your local superintendent. You don't have to divulge who that is if you're uncomfortable.
I would say have a curriculum for the mentors. I think too often we just put people in a room and hope magic happens.
And any recommended curriculum maybe folks can put into the chat, either from the mentor team or Adam, if you want to chime in with any of that.
I'll pass it to Sam.
Great, thanks. I think my biggest recommendation to a superintendent is that, kind of what David says, if you're serious about having relationship focused schools, you have to make investments, and those investments are largely going to be, you know, structural. So having systems in place that, you know, you have dedicated labor to fostering these relationships, making the connections, adequate training, support, and supervision, so that mentors have guidance for meeting young people's needs.
So resources, not just rhetoric around relationships.
Exactly. Well put.
Great. And Bernadette, finally, one tip to your local superintendent.
Sure. Yeah. And just to, I guess my advice is just to reiterate what we've already been talking about here. You know, as we go back, a lot of focus has been on learning loss and trying to get our students to catch up, but keeping in mind that our students have experienced so much trauma and loss this past year, and making sure that their own socio-emotional needs are being met, you know, and, you know, finding the resources that's needed to make sure those are being met before we can focus on the traditional aspects, you know, of education.
Great input from all three of you. Thank you so much. And sorry to rush off of this, but I'm sure you guys are willing to talk offline with anyone interested in learning more about your research. And thanks all for listening. I'm going to hand it off now to next panel on SEL and mentoring. Thanks, guys.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much to Julia and that amazing panel. You know, feel free to look through the chat as well for a lot of the different links and resources related to that amazing conversation by our great panel. Thank you so much for that. And I think that the ending there really set us up really well for this next panel, which will focus on, you know, mentoring to build SEL skills, habits, and mindsets, and really will touch on some of those questions around how do you build the structure and the systems and the capacity and the climate and the curriculum and all those pieces. And we have an amazing group to really dive even more into that work as well. And so I'd like to invite our panelists on now, Margot Ross, Center for Supportive Schools, Laura Green, I Mentor Baltimore, and Darren Person from Fresno Unified School District to join us in this, you know, really important conversation around how to design, you know, schools and initiatives that put students and relationships first, you know, which is an important philosophy that anchors, you know, our work at Mentor around relationship-centered schools. Acknowledging the different kinds of mentoring and approaches that exist in schools and districts to support the infrastructure and culture building needed to provide students access to these important relationships. And we have 3 amazing partners who have very distinct and unique ways that they approach this work and really represent the breadth of mentoring that can happen, from district-led systemic, approach to, how technology can really be leveraged to help facilitate school and district collaboration and reach the majority of kids in a school versus only a sample, as well as, capacity building peer mentoring models that help to enhance school climate. And so what I'd like to do is toss it over to each of our panelists to talk a little bit about, how do you bring this work to life? How does your organization approach this work through your partnerships and really add some additional notes to the great conversation that we're having? So I'll toss it over first to Margot Ross, who will talk a little bit about Center for Supportive Schools approach to this work.
Thanks, Dudney. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for including us. I'm thrilled to be here and be part of this really timely and thoughtful conversation. I know I've only got a few minutes, so I'm just going to try and offer a little taste of our approach and highlight a few things that I think are important concepts to think about as you move forward in your work. So we can move to the first slide. CSS is a national organization, and our mission is to help schools become places where students want to be. And I think it's pretty obvious that we wouldn't be able to realize that vision without focusing on developing strong relationships and building social and emotional skills. So our work is deeply grounded in the principles and research that you've been hearing about so far. This slide also says that we leverage the resources in schools to create safer and more supportive communities. And that's part of what Dudney just mentioned. I want to underscore that in terms of CSS being a capacity building organization. Our work is fully integrated into the school program and utilizes school faculty and students as mentors. And in our capacity building role, we provide the training, curriculum, and support to help schools create the infrastructure that will sustain this work long term. We can move to the next slide. This just gives a really quick overview of our peer mentoring model. It's called Peer Group Connection, or PGC. And PGC schools put into place a daily course for credit. It's taught by the school's own faculty, and older students are enrolled in the course. They learn the leadership and SEL skills to be mentors and positive role models for incoming students, 6th graders in middle schools and 9th graders in high schools. I think this is a good opportunity to underscore the importance of transitions in this moment. We know that students are vulnerable during the transition into middle or high school under the best of circumstances, and the current state of affairs, which the research panel talked about so eloquently, will likely exacerbate these vulnerabilities for many students. And so we need to be even more intentional about creating safe spaces for students that are transitioning that will help them navigate this really complex time. The next slide provides a visual overview of the structure of PGC. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but I put this here to emphasize an idea that I think David kind of kicked us off with about resources. No schools and districts need to create these structures from scratch. Nobody needs to start with a blank slate here. CSS has been partnering with schools for over 40 years. This structure is sound and proven. There are many organizations like ours out there to help you build your capacity to do this work and make it stick. The next slide lists these SEL competencies that are targeted in our curriculum for both peer mentors and mentees. And we get at these competencies through hands-on interactive activities that the older peers lead with small groups of younger students. PGC is a peer-to-peer group mentoring model. And so that's how we approach helping to build these competencies for the young people. And then the final two slides highlight some of our research findings. This one in the areas of attendance, GPA, and graduation rates. And so just another example that demonstrates how intentionally focusing on relationships in SEL does result in measurable improvements in these critical education outcomes. And then finally, the last slide lists the specific SEL outcomes where we've documented measurable improvements. So I know that was just a really quick taste. I'm certainly happy to talk more deeply about any of these aspects of our work and share evaluation reports for those who are interested. But I will stop there because I'm so excited to hear about what my colleagues have to say about their work as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Margot, for that great presentation. We'll toss it over now to Laura Green, who will share about iMentor Baltimore's approach to this work. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you so much. iMentor Baltimore, we are part of a regional national model. We are actually a college and career access model that uses the power of relationships as the mechanism to actually support young people in actualizing their fullest potential. You can read about me in my bio, but this work is personal to me. I do this work because I was adopted. I was born into the DC foster care system. And so I am acutely aware of the importance of having a caring adult in a young person's life. So with that, we can go to the next slide and jump right into the iMentor model. We can go to the next slide. And the next slide, this speaks to the fact that educational inequity exists. That's why we are all here. For far too long, success has been determined by zip code rather than potential. So as we move to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about a little quick people poll and what the need actually is in the state of Maryland. What do you think the ratio is of guidance counselor to student? I'm sorry, if we could go back to the previous, oh yeah, to that slide, perfect. Again, the question to everyone, and you can throw it in the chat, what do you think the guidance counselor to student ratio is in the state of Maryland? And I'm not gonna harp on this too long. We probably know what the answers are. We can click forward. The answer in the state of Maryland is 1 guidance counselor to 356 students. So that is the average caseload. iMentor aims to turn that 356-to-1 ratio into a 1-to-1 ratio by pairing every student in our program with a mentor. It's not someone who has to be an expert on the college or career access process, but simply an adult who can use our curriculum and their own experience to be a champion for a student. So we can move forward on the next slide. And how do we do that? 3 parts to our model. One is we are a whole school model. When we partner with the school, we serve every student in that school, not just the high flyers or not just the ones who have extra struggles, but every student receives a mentor their junior year and follows them their senior year, as well as 2 years after high school graduation on their post-secondary journey. We are a mentoring program, as I mentioned earlier, with a North Star that historically for the past 20 years has been on college success. But as times have changed, so have we are focused on college and workforce development success. And lastly, we have a guided curriculum. We are actually an in-school program. We are not an after-school program. So we do teach a weekly iMentor class. And we encourage our mentors to communicate once a week with their mentees and participate in monthly events that's all part of our guided curriculum. We can go to the next slide. And this is the big picture. iMentor has been around since 1999. Since that time, we've served over 8,800 students in 4 different cities: New York, Chicago, the Bay, and now Baltimore. We also partner with Big Brothers and Big Sisters nationally, where we serve several of their sites using our curriculum and our technology-based platform to deliver their mentoring program. Lastly, Baltimore, we are the youngest region in the iMentor portfolio, and we are going into our 3rd year of programmatic operation. In our first 2 years, we have served around 135 pairs. In this upcoming school year, we are looking at serving between 150 to 200 pairs. We literally double, if not triple, every year because of our whole school model. We can go to the next slide, which talks a little bit about our impact. So current national and actually local data hovers around 74% high school graduation, 51% college enrollment. And then you see that big drop for college completion around 26% after about 5 or 6 years. Students enrolled in the iMentor program tend to experience a 82% high school graduation rate, 66% college enrollment rate, and then that completion rate almost doubles to 49% within 5 or 6 years. And we can advance to the next slide. We ask our mentors to do 3 simple things: communicate with their mentees weekly, and we have a technology-based platform in which that happens. We also have a mobile app. We ask that they meet with their peers monthly, and of course this past year that's been virtual. And we ask that they engage with each other in our mentor community spaces. We can go to the next slide. We'll skip over this in the essence of time and go to the next slide. I did want to speak a little bit about the mentor education program. This kind of came up earlier. We are a DEI focused organization. That said, we are not DEI experts, but we do create self-guided online modules for our mentors to educate themselves on several DEI topics. And some of those also are like trauma informed education and curriculum, mentoring across differences, which could be generational, could be cultural, could be ethnic, whatever those differences are. We let our mentors know we are not an expert. We are learning right alongside of them, but it is important that mentoring is not something that's happening to students, but it's happening with them, and that students have tremendous agency in this process, and that learning is absolutely bi-directional. So a lot of that great work is happening in our mentor education spaces. And I just want to thank you all for this time today. And that ends my part of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Laura. Between both presentations, so much, amazing content to build off of. We're excited now to toss it over to Darren Person, Fresno Unified School District, to share your perspective and the great work you've been doing from within the district around the work of mentoring. Thank you, Darren.
Thank you, Dutney. Thank you, everybody. You can move to. My name is Darren Person, and I oversee the mentoring program for Fresno Unified School District. We don't know about Fresno. We're in the Central Valley of California, but we're actually the 3rd largest school district in the state of California. I think it's important, as I talk, I want to just present to you a little bit what we've done. We are a centralized mentoring office. I actually started the mentoring office 13 years ago. So I want to tell you a little bit about just a synopsis of our philosophy, our programs, kind of explain the phenomena that had occurred in our district, and maybe just share to you in the next 2 minutes about some of our experience that we learned and where we hope to go with our programs. You can go to the next slide. I mean, that statement by Comer that mentions about, relationships are important. I mean, oftentimes you hear that, but I would say we do adhere to that in Fresno Unified School District. And if you listen to me, you hear that we have our own mentoring office. So therefore, this work is not on the side of our desk. I actually have an office of 10. And then also we have over 50 teachers, counselors that are associated with our mentoring program. So I would say to start off that we really believe that relationships are important, and Fresno Unified have made that emotional and also fiscal investment into doing that. Our whole aim is to create a culture in our district. That's why it was so important when I got asked to be part of this panel, when you talk about relationship-centered schools, that culture is very important because we're limited in how many students that we can reach if we don't create a culture. Let's go to the next slide. I want to just give you a little synopsis of what we've done. When we first got here, we didn't have a structured program. So we had various programs starting up throughout our schools that didn't have a consistent matching or screening process. So this is my best attempt to show you kind of like our recruitment piece. I draw to a few things, right? One is if you see that we recruit from our community and also internally, but what's really been, and I say a blessing, because mentor, in terms of the elements of effective practices for mentoring, which is like a Bible in terms of that, I leaned on that and continue to lean on that in terms of setting up our infrastructure. So here you see that we have a centralized office where elements of effective practice that help guide us to be able to then match students back either at a school site or at one of our partners. I'll talk about that in a few seconds. Next slide, please. The next piece, just to give you a synopsis of our growth. When I came in 2008, we had 255 students that were involved in mentoring. Right now, and we're over 4,000 students, right? Tremendous growth. If you look at the blue line, it talks about how many mentors that we recruited. I think we're missing a few here because we continue to grow, especially utilizing our internal mentors. And we are very happy, but again, we got 4,000 students. We have over 70,000 students in our district. So I really want to talk about that culture, but I want to talk to you a little bit about how we grew. So maybe that next slide will kind of help me kind of go over that with you. I think the uniqueness of Fresno Unified is that we're not afraid to try various different types of programs, right? So what we found out is once we started our one-on-one, we were limited in how many people could actually mentor. So if you look at just a brief kind of synopsis, and you can look on our website to kind of look at some of our other programs. We do one-on-one, we do group, which is a Girl Power Young Men of Character. We have an e-mentoring program. This year we worked with I Could Be. We do a community-based model, and we do a peer mentoring model, which is our newest model that's taken off, where we utilize students to also be mentors. And then also MBK Success Mentoring, we do that as well. For us to be able to do that, we really do lean heavily on our school sites. We require that any school site that would be partnering with us would give us a person that would allocate their time to be our facilitator. That has really helped out on our growth. Also, in each of the programs you see here, we provide structure, we have research-based curriculum, we provide professional learning throughout the year. We even do paid fingerprinting for anybody that wants to mentor, because again, we were very limited at one time. So to be able to grow, we had to remove some of the barriers. Next slide. Thank you. And in the ending, I think what's important is for us, and for you in terms of what we did, is obviously we grew. I think the next step for us has been, where do we go from here? And when I talk about culture, again, we've been leaning on Mentor. We do have our own local in terms of Mentor California. We've been working with, again, Mentor and relationship-centered schools. So our goal now is to take what we've done, move in the area of relationship-centered schools, so our schools can now almost duplicate the work that we're doing. We started off very small doing that now, but we're looking at just success across the boards, because again, what we've found out in every school would like to see mentor increase, but they just need to support. And that's what we've tried to do through our mentor office. Thank you for the time.
Thank you each so much for the great presentation around, your approaches for how to bring work to life. For the interest of time, we're going to do a lightning round, about one minute each. What advice, if any, do you each have for the audience around how they can approach partnership and defining roles, to really start to integrate this relationship-centered approach at school? You each have these distinct approaches that all help schools and students with recovery, reentry, with culture building. What advice do you have for schools and districts that are looking to look deeper on how to rally everyone in the system together to support this work on the ground?
Yeah, I'll jump in, Denny. I mean, just really quick, Professor Unify, a great question. What I've discovered in my short time here, that there are some treasures in our community. There's CBOs, right? There internally we can also leverage. There's our colleges that we can leverage. I think the hard part is to get everybody on the same page, but I think there has to be just a intentional effort. Like, for instance, we partner right now with a local group of African-American men that call themselves Street Saints. They want to help, they want to mentor, but sometimes they don't know how. So we help build their capacity. So I would say for you that are doing the work, don't be afraid, and then also have some patience, even with some of those local treasures around. Obviously, there's the big guys, but invest in them, because they can actually pay enormous contributions to your organization if you build them up. And we do that through our professional learning with them, and also just guiding them through. And we've seen a significant increase because of taking our time and really creating some partners and being intentional about it.
I would love to piggyback off of the off of that answer. I think that's spot on. I like to say a rising tide raises all ships. I think a lot of good college access, workforce development programs, mentoring programs are operating in silos to the extent that we can get together and leverage what we do best and then share that. Is the best way to really start getting creative around partnerships. And then someone said it earlier, I think it was Sam, you know, a lot of this stuff isn't free. So through creative partnerships, I think there's also a way to access money in funds in a more powerful, impactful way when we start doing things more jointly.
Yep, I will join in on this theme. I mean, I think what we're talking about is stakeholder development work, and that aspect of the work should be just as intentional as every other piece of the puzzle that we're talking about. Spending that time on the front end, identifying those, you know, resources in the community and the people who, people and agencies and organizations who can partner and be supports, getting their buy-in, getting their commitment. That takes time, that takes money, that takes energy, but it's critical work to do on the front end. And so, you know, ensuring that your stakeholders are lined up, ready, supporting, champions, that's a critical piece of the puzzle.
Thank you so much, Margot, for closing us out. Those champions really are incredibly important. Thank you, Laura, Darren, Margot, for your time today. And, you know, everyone feel free to reach out if you have additional questions as well. And we will now pass it over to Stephen from LPI to close us out today. Thank you for having us.
Well, thank you, Dudney, and thank you, David, Abby, and the rest of the Mentor team for your partnership in putting together today's event, and to our speakers for sharing strong examples of student-centered supports and how they can meet the social, emotional, and mental health needs of students. I want to conclude by describing how districts can utilize COVID relief funds not only to meet the short-term needs of students and communities, but also make longer-term investments to build relationships, accelerate learning, and close opportunity and achievement gaps. The Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act, enacted in December of 2020, and the American Rescue Plan Act, enacted of March of 2021, provide states and districts with over $176 billion. These laws provide great flexibility in their use of funds. For example, districts' funds can be spent on any educational expense that's allowed under the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Act, the Perkins Career and Technical Education Act, and other specific allowable uses mentioned in these laws. These include providing mental health services, implementing community schools, and planning after-school programs. The American Rescue Plan Act requires 20% of district funds and 5% of state funds be allocated to address learning recovery, and that states must set aside 1% of funds each for after-school programming and summer enrichment. States and districts have until September 30th of 2024 to obligate American Rescue Plan Act funds, and at least 120 days after that deadline to spend the funds. You can find more information on how to use federal recovery funds strategically in fact sheets we posted on our website, and you can find them in the chat as well. We have also published recommendations that Adam mentioned on how educators and policymakers can ensure supports for social emotional learning, redesign schools for stronger relationships, and provide expanded learning time. For example, to focus on social emotional learning, you can implement comprehensive and integrated systems of support, such as multi-tiered system of support with counselors, mentors, and other behavioral mental health and trauma professionals. Or you can enact and enable social emotional learning by adopting standards and guidance for restorative practices, or providing funding and supports for curriculum resources, in addition to offering professional development to help educators infuse social emotional learning into their instruction. To aid in building relationships You can cultivate supportive environments with emotional safety and belonging by dedicating time in small student cohorts and learning communities, or enact policies that support relationship-centered school design, such as advisory classes, looping, block scheduling, longer grade spans, and interdisciplinary teaching teams. And to provide expanded learning time, you can also incorporate a lot of what we've heard from our panelists by infusing high-quality tutoring within and beyond the school day, expanding after-school programs, and the reach and duration of early learning programs. You can find these and additional recommendations and resources in our report titled Restarting and Reinventing School on the Learning Policy Institute's website, which will also be shared in the chat. I hope the examples that you've heard today can guide your efforts to address the trauma of the previous school year and offer a relationship-centered template for a restorative fall. Please follow up with me and my fellow panelists if you have any question about today's briefing. We hope that our conversations today lead to more in the future. Finally, be on the lookout for a follow-up email with a recording of this event and resources related to the issues we discussed. Thank you and have a great rest of your day.